So you're interested in picking up watercolor painting and you're not 100% sure what to actually buy. Now, the great news is watercolor is a very accessible medium to start painting with. It's not, I wouldn't say it's dirt cheap, but it isn't terribly expensive, and you can really get yourself set up with a nice compact kit of supplies and be able to spend hours and hours painting with the first items that you buy. So I'll go through the basics that you need to pick up, or you might even have around the house to be able to start painting watercolors. So as a new watercolor artist, I would suggest buying a small pre-made watercolor palette. Now this is one by Winsor & Newton, which is a really nice brand. This is their Cotman brand, which is essentially a word that means student. So it is nice quality, but not as high-end as their artist quality brands, but it still is a really nice set of paints to work with and a lot less expensive. Now the nice thing about this kit, it comes with 12 watercolors already in pans. So these little rectangular squares, or rectangular bits of paint, those are pans. And it also comes with a palette space that you can use to mix. So that's what this side is. And this one you can pull out and you actually get multiple bits of palette space. And you get a little brush. This one isn't popping up. There we go. Sometimes you need to use the brush. So you can have all this extra space to do mixing. So that's really handy. But that isn't necessary. You can do a bit of mixing in this sort of space if you go with another brand. You can do tubes. So you might be able to find some tubes in the store. This is one tube of Cotman watercolor paint. This is also Winsor & Newton. And essentially you would have to buy an empty palette, or you would squeeze a little bit of this out onto a palette. Like you can use like an old plate or something like that to be able to put your colors out and mix them. With a palette like this, you just add a little bit of water to each of these and it kind of softens up, and then you can just paint for quite some time. This one's nice because it does come with a little brush, but if you do want to spend a lot of time painting watercolors, I would actually recommend you get a separate brush because it's quite short. It's nice to have a bit of a longer brush. So I have some brushes here. As a beginner, I would suggest using a fairly inexpensive brand. You don't want to splash out and spend, you can easily spend $100 or more on an actual paintbrush. I can't remember the price for these Princeton Heritage brushes off the top of my head, but I believe it was mid-teens or something like that. And they're quite a nice brush. These are round 6 and a round 10. And round just basically means, let's see if I can get it to focus. Round just basically means it's kind of circular, as you can see. The round ones are really nice. They're kind of all-purpose. You can paint florals, you can paint landscapes, you can paint portraits, all sorts of things. I have also brought a different brand. This is a store brand of a store that's in British Columbia, and it's also a fairly inexpensive watercolor brush, but it is a flat. So as you can see, it is square on this side, but you turn like that, and it's quite narrow. And those can be quite handy I find for landscapes, but you can, if you're just looking at getting 1 or 2 watercolor brushes, I would recommend starting with the rounds and get a couple different sizes. One that's a little bit bigger, one that's a little bit smaller, so you can apply a fair amount of paint with the larger brush and do a bit more detail with the smaller brush. And when you're choosing, you're going to need to choose between synthetic and natural. These are synthetics. I would suggest synthetics for any brand new watercolor artist because they are a lot less expensive. And these Princeton ones and this Opus brand, Opus is the name of the store. They're nice and snappy. Snappy means it kind of snaps back into its shape quite nicely. And I find that a lot easier and nicer to work with. I do have some quite soft brushes that are synthetics as well, and I do find they're not quite as nice to work with, at least personally. You'll find as you go along in your watercolor journey, you'll find what you really, really like. So that's brushes. Let's make sure you get your palette with your paint and then your brushes. Now, Next major choice you're going to have is paper, because you need to be able to paint onto something. So I brought two different options here. For a lot of beginners, I would recommend a less expensive watercolor paper. So the Strathmore watercolor block, I've had a fair amount of success with it compared to a lot of the less expensive watercolor papers. And it is, well, it's relatively inexpensive, and it's made of cellulose, so basically wood pulp. But watercolor paper, you don't want to use just any kind of paper. Watercolor paper is just, I don't know if you can kind of hear it, it's quite thick, and you want that because you're using paint and water, so you don't want it to curl up. But let's say you already have a lot of drawing skills, strong drawing skills. You are coming from another art medium, let's say acrylics, oils, so you already understand shape and form and color. So you might start with some very successful paintings quite quickly. I would suggest using 100% cotton paper. This is Arches. This is a huge pad of it. Can't even fit it all on screen. But you look for 100% cotton, and that generally means you're going to have a good quality watercolor paper. It's a lot more expensive. You can, when you're first starting out, absolutely use the less expensive cellulose paper. I showed you the 100% cotton labeling on the Arches. The less expensive paper that isn't 100% cotton is not going to say what it's made of, and that's essentially how you'll know the difference. It's either 100% cotton or it's just regular wood pulp paper or cellulose paper. The difference is Arches or any or most 100% cotton watercolor paper, it just generally works a lot better with a really loose watercolor style, letting the water and the paint flow together. Tends to work more nicely than it does on the less expensive cellulose paper. But if you're doing quite detailed paintings, sometimes the cellulose paper is almost just good enough. And it's a lot less expensive. Now, another thing that you're going to have to choose when you're choosing your watercolor paper is you will see cold press, you'll see also hot press or rough. I recommend cold press for beginners. So this is cold press, this Arches, it's also cold press. And that's kind of, it's kind of like middle of the road between the hot press and the rough paper. Rough paper has a lot of texture to it. Hot press has very little texture to it, and cold press is kind of in the middle. So it's a good one to start with. Okay, now, chosen your paper, you've chosen your brushes, you've picked up your watercolor palette. Now you just need a handful of other things, and you might actually have these laying around. So you need a water container. I use 2. I believe these are, I don't know, pickle jars or something like that. You don't need to buy anything special for it. I use 2, so I have one for my clean water and one that tends to get dirty quite quickly. So when I'm painting, palette doesn't like to open very much. I take a bit of water from the water container, I mix up my paints, I do my painting, and then I put my first kind of water rinse in this one, so the water gets quite dirty, and then I go back to this one where it's fairly clean water, and then I take that water and I go back to the paint. So essentially I have 2, and one ends up being quite dirty and one ends up being fairly clean. Okay, so another thing you'll need is, let's see, some sort of a cloth to kind of dab off your paintbrush as you're painting, because watercolor painting, it's all about your water control. Sometimes you want a lot of water, sometimes you just want a little bit of water. So you go into your clean water container and you don't want quite that much water, so you just kind of dab it off. This is an old flour sack tea towel. It is not dirty, it's just stained from paint. Some people use paper towel. And then a pencil. This is what I use to just do an initial sketch of what I want to paint. You don't need a pencil, but it is handy, especially if you want to do something that is particularly detailed and not overly loose. You might want to, draw out the person's portrait a little bit, so you have a guide of where you're painting. If you are going to use a pencil, try and use one that is fairly pale. So this is a 3H. That means it's hard. So when you're drawing on it, it's not going to show up too dark, because as soon as you paint over it with your watercolor, you can't erase it, and it can show through with especially the paler watercolors or less opaque watercolors. So if you're in a store and you look and you see a 3B, don't buy that, because B is quite soft in comparison to this, and it'll be quite dark. And last but not least, washi tape. So washi tape is just these little colorful rolls of tape. And essentially what I use this for is I just use it to put edges, like the edges of my painting, so that I can have a nice hard kind of side to the painting. And that is it. That's all you need. You don't need washi tape. You don't need a pencil. You could probably get away without some sort of a cloth, but that might be a little bit tricky. But you need your palette with some paint, space for mixing, you need some paper, you need brushes, and you need water containers. And other than that, you don't need anything else. You just need to put some practice in and have some fun.